Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RegGameTedCon video, I've got a question for you. How many cores will the Ryzen 3000 series, aka Matisse processors feature? If you said 16 cores, 32 threads, most likely you are going to be correct. But that leads us to the logical question of, well, when will those processors see the light of day? Will we see a delay for the 16 core processors compared to, let's say, the 12 core processors? Well, the answer to that is possibly. You might recall yesterday I covered a story that was first doing the rounds on Tom's Hardware, where they had discovered a retailer operating in Singapore by the name of Bigram listed all of the prices for the Ryzen 3000 series SKUs. And this was from the Ryzen 3s, which of course feature 6 cores, 12 threads, or I say of course, it hasn't been confirmed officially yet, all the way up to the Ryzen 9s, which feature 16 cores, 32 threads. And the retailer in question has a couple of things going for them. The first is that they're not unknown in Singapore. They are actually pretty well established. The second thing, and this is probably the most important, is that they also have a history of leaking things before they're released, and that leak turns out to be accurate, and this includes Intel's 9th generation CPUs. If you want more information on this, by the way, you can check out yesterday's video. I'll try to remember to link it in the description of this one. But there has been a couple of developments since then, and some of those have taken place on Twitter, and also a couple of my sources have whispered stuff to me as well. So the first thing is Jim over at Adored TV actually gave me a DM, and he wanted to give me an update because he and I are kind of discussing things of what our sources have been telling us. And one of the things he told me is that, according to one of his trusted sources, the prices that we're seeing over at Tom's Hardware are most likely rather accurate, with the caveats of, well, it depends obviously on the retailer, the sales tax, and so on and so on. But most likely it's pretty darn close to what we will be paying at retail. The second thing he told me is that, according to his trusted source, we might see a delay for the 16-core 32-thread processor, and it will not see the light of day until December. Now, he did not tell me this in isolation, because another chap that I regularly speak to, COmet on Twitter, who couldn't tell me all of the information because he's also obviously trying to protect his sources, he said very similar, that according to whispers he's heard from people in the industry, we will see similar, that we'll see the 12-core processors and below launch first, and the 16-core processor launch later. Most likely, it appears that AMD are targeting December-ish, but this has not been nailed down yet. According to both of them so far, the idea is pretty simple. They are trying to figure out when they want to launch the processors and the spacing and timing of it. And this actually ties in rather nicely with the previous leaks that I've mentioned to you all regarding the Ryzen 3000 series CPUs, including the launch of July. Now, you might recall that according to my sources and multiple sources, AMD are yet to provide the engineering sample CPUs to their board partners. So basically, motherboard vendors thus far do not have engineering sample CPUs. But more to the point, they know that there's a 12-core processor coming, but they don't have any details yet on the 16-core CPUs. So it's possible then that one of the reasons that they know more about the 12-core and below is because AMD are more confident about this. Now, I'm trying to find out more information from a couple of my sources right now regarding what AMD's plans are and if they've heard any information regarding this. But the whispers are so far that AMD are basically planning to launch the 12-core processors first, and then we'll fill out the lineup with the 16 cores at a later date. And there are actually a couple of logical reasons that AMD may choose to do this. COmet Lake, which I'll get into in just a second, is of course launching from Intel later on. So what AMD may decide is that until they know exactly how COmet Lake performs, they could basically launch a 12-core CPU, hold things back, and then decide on prices and so on when they see what COmet Lake is capable of. And there is also another reason which has got nothing to do with Intel whatsoever, and that is that Well, it kind of works out in terms of yields. We all know that, you know, binning is a thing, and if an 8-core processor doesn't quite make 8 cores because it either doesn't have, let's say, all of the cores working or some of the cache is damaged or something, it can go and become a 6-core processor. Or if the cores are not capable of hitting, let's say, a stable clock speed, then it can be binned at a lower speed processor, and so on and so on. That's been like part of the industry for, well, forever, basically. And there is another reason, coming to think of it, it also works well for marketing and the hype train. Because don't let anyone tell you differently, marketing and hype for hardware is just as important as it is for games. And we all know that the game industry are like masters of hype, whether it comes to DLC or deliberately, purposefully leaking, let's say, a screenshot or something to get people talking about something. And hardware is really the same thing. It is essentially about capturing time in the news, and that's one of the reasons almost certainly we saw the launch of the Radeon 7 GPUs. I'm getting somewhat on a tangent here, but we can pretty much all agree that the Radeon 7, whether we think it's a great product, a bad product, or somewhere in between, I personally think it's somewhere in between to a pretty good product, but that's my personal opinion. I think we can all agree that one of the main reasons it was launched was to grab time in the news, for people to be reminded that AMD provide GPUs. So what AMD might be doing here, and this is speculation, I do not know this from a source, I just want to make that abundantly clear, but one of their thought processes here could be, hey, let's wait until people start getting excited about COmet Lake and then announce our 16-core 32-thread processor. Now, speaking of COmet Lake and Intel, I actually heard it from another source, so this is like a third source now that have told me that COmet Lake is indeed going to feature up to 10 cores, and it will launch next year. I don't have performance information. I don't know, for example, how many megahertz it's going to have, and I don't know if it's going to give you coffee in the morning, but I do know it's going to be a 10 core part, and AMD will be facing this CPU next year. And from what we understand, of course, AMD are going to be going all out with the Ryzen 3000 series processors, but we don't know yet how it's going to stack up against COmet Lake, either in clock speed, IPC, and so much other stuff. So it's going to be really interesting, because from the perspective of gamers, and I know a lot of people who are interested in both COmet Lake and Matisse, one could make an argument, and I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are here, so please let me know in the comments. Do you really care about more than, let's say, 10 to 12 cores? Particularly if you're just a gamer. As here's the thing. If you own an 8700K, let's just take an 8700K for a moment, that CPU is pretty much good to go for a long time. Let's just be honest, particularly if you overclock it. Most 8700Ks can hit 5-ish gigahertz all core. Now, there are some games which definitely do hammer the CPU more. One of the games that I'm actually adding into my benchmark selection right now is actually Hitman 2. And we all know that there is a simulation option, which is better if you have more processor cores, because it does really hammer CPU performance, which is something that maybe I might investigate further, depending on my time schedule. But either way, there are certainly some games which do really get impacted with CPU. Civilization, Ashes of the Singularity, blah de blah de blah. But generally speaking, 6 cores-ish, 8 cores certainly, you're probably not going to need much more for some time. But with that said, one of the benefits, of course, of a 16-core processor, depending on how well it scales and how it performs in different tasks, because that's the other thing as well, we don't really know if dual channel memory is going to be enough. From what I've heard from multiple sources, and from what changes AMD are making, supposedly in the architecture and other changes just, you know, on the Infinity Fabric and the memory subsystem and, you know, IO controller and all the stuff we've talked about umpteen and one times, most likely it will be okay. And supposedly AMD are bumping up the supported clock speed of the RAM up to 3200 megahertz, but either way, we don't really know if that's going to be enough to feed 16 cores, 32 threads, if the CPU is really being hammered, like really being hammered, let's say with 3D rendering or something that really pushes the memory subsystem. So these are questions, of course, we don't really know yet. So I can't answer for gamers, particularly for extreme gamers, if you're looking for that minimum frame rate, how AMD are going to compare to Intel. I can tell you that one of my sources has told me that they believe AMD are going to be cranking up the clock speed, but I also suspect Intel will do similar. So it's going to be very interesting to see how all of this plays out. Another thing as well that I was told by another person is a much smaller leak, and well, I say leak, it's more of a small update to something I've said previously. You might recall regarding the whole Navi thing, one of the things I'd said is that AIBs had actually been briefed regarding the specs and performance targets of Navi. I've not yet been able to find out what the actual specs are because my source is being super duper cagey about that. But one thing he had told me, and yes, I do know he works for a company that definitely would know this stuff. He had told me, and this is once again a different source, that they were briefed back in like October, November-ish, which also tells me that most likely Navi was delayed, because one of the theories right now is that Navi had been delayed, and someone else had told me, who happens to have ties with AMD, that well, basically Navi was a nightmare. I've mentioned that previously in other videos, so it looks like all of this is tied together. The Navi was originally supposed to launch a bit earlier, but they had issues that had to be retaped, or whatever other issues they faced, and basically it had to be delayed 3 to several months. And that's why we saw the launch of the Radeon 7 graphics cards. Does that mean that I think Navi is going to be bad? No. I think that AMD know that they've got a lot of pressure on them, so it's going to be interesting to me how they respond to all of this, and whether we actually get a product which is going to be a completely new architecture. My thought process is so far that I do believe Navi is a radically different architecture to what we've seen previously. Multiple reasons, but certainly not limited to the fact that Sony helped fund Navi, the fact that we've seen so many different patents, the fact that David Wang over at AMD said that we want to redefine performance / per watt and per dollar, and even the other things such as variable rate shading, which is most likely developed for console use as well as PC as well. All of those things most likely tell me that AMD are doing this either for Arcturus, or most likely this is going to be for Navi. But either way, we're just going to have to wait and see. To me, though, the next couple of years are going to be extremely interesting in technology, because obviously with the next generation of consoles, you have that, what's the word? What would be the best word? Pressure, I suppose, of keeping down prices as much as possible on the GPU side of things. And I think most of us would agree that spending, let's say, $500 or $600 to play at 1440p is a lot of cash, particularly when, let's say, the next generation Xbox is most likely going to be cheaper than that, and you get a full console. Yes, I'm not saying that console gaming is better than PC or anything, but I'm just saying from the mainstream consumer point of view, most likely we will need to see those prices come down, and I suspect even Nvidia as well are thinking about this very same thing. And we all know that the next generation of GeForce cards is going to be leveraging the 7nm Samsung process. Supposedly that's going to happen in 2020, and it's going to be using Ampere, although that's not confirmed by any means. And actually, if you think about it, Ampere was one of the rumored code names for the RTX 20 series. There was some ambiguity whether it was going to be Turing or Ampere, and for a while it looked like, yes, it was definitely Ampere, and then, no, pull the sneaky on you, it's actually Turing. So maybe what happened is that Nvidia didn't feel comfortable yet for 7nm, or maybe they just felt that Turing was like the intermediary step between them. So obviously no one really knows yet though what Ampere is. It could be a completely refreshed architecture, it could just be a slight tweak to what we've got now, we just don't know. So what AMD will be facing in 2020 is going to be a bit of a mystery, and something I'm going to be exploring in a different video with you all. But there you go. And as normal, take some of the stuff with a large pinch of salt, because ultimately roadmaps can change. AMD may decide to just, you know, the yields are really good for Zen 2, and from what we've heard so far, 7nm is doing pretty well. But it's not just, you know, whether it does pretty well, it's also their decisions regarding the upcoming products from Intel, the decisions to keep relevant in the news cycles, and so much more besides. So, to me, It kind of sucks if they do decide to release a 16-core part later. It sucks for us as customers. It works out well for them, but I also suspect that a 12-core CPU will do most people fairly well for a long time. With that said, it also, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw people who own a 12-core Ryzen part, let's for the sake of this video call it a 3700, and then say, oh gee, you know what, I just want to go and get a 16-core processor. They may not have any actual need for that number of cores, even if the clock speeds end up being the same. Let's just say for the sake of this video that both CPUs do exactly the same clock speed on average for overclocking, but they might just want it just to say that they've got a 16-part processor. And we all know that there are those people around, so it's going to be very interesting to see how people's decisions are factored in. I also have to say that it is rather humbling that people have been sending me leaks and information, because ultimately it's kind of dangerous for them in terms of their job. So it's very humbling that people want to provide me this information. Obviously, I'm never going to say that, you know, it's this person at this particular company who, you know, reveals this information, but at the end of the day, they still are taking a risk that they don't really have to. So I am extremely appreciative of that. Anyway, and now I'd just like to say thank you very much for watching the video. You can subscribe if you want more of me for whatever reason, and you can comment below. Do let me know how many cores you would like in your upcoming Ryzen processor, and if you could like the video and share it as well, well, by golly gosh, you would just be my favorite person of the day. With all that said, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.